The clock on Maya Carter's dashboard showed 9:47 p.m. as she drove down the empty highway toward home. She had just finished her shift at the campus bookstore and was looking forward to getting back to her dorm room. The 19-year-old college student hummed along to the music playing softly from her phone, thinking about the psychology exam she had to study for tomorrow. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror, causing her heart to skip a beat. Maya had never been pulled over before, and she checked her speedometer nervously. She was going 53 in a 55 zone, well within the speed limit. She pulled over to the shoulder of the road and turned off her engine, placing her hands on the steering wheel just like her father had taught her during driving lessons. Officer Kyle Morrison stepped out of his patrol car with deliberate slowness. He was a 15-year veteran of the Riverside Police Department, a man who had grown bitter and angry over the years. Morrison adjusted his belt and walked toward Maya's small sedan, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. Something about the young woman behind the wheel irritated him immediately, though he could not quite put his finger on what it was. Maya rolled down her window as Morrison approached. "Good evening, officer," she said politely, keeping her voice steady despite her nervousness. "Was I doing something wrong?" Morrison shined his flashlight directly into Maya's face, causing her to squint. "License and registration," he demanded without answering her question. His voice carried an edge that made Maya feel uncomfortable. "May I ask why you pulled me over?" Maya asked as she reached slowly for her purse. "I was watching my speed and I don't think I was speeding." "Don't ask me questions," Morrison snapped. "Just give me your documents." He watched as Maya carefully retrieved her license from her wallet and reached into the glove compartment for her registration. Something about her calm demeanor annoyed him further. Maya handed over the documents with a slight tremor in her hands. Morrison examined them under his flashlight, taking much longer than necessary. "Maya Carter," he read aloud. "Where are you coming from tonight, Maya?" "I work at the college bookstore," Maya replied. "I just got off my shift and I'm heading back to campus." Morrison walked back to his patrol car, ostensibly to run her license through the system. What Maya did not know was that Morrison had already decided this would not be a routine traffic stop. He had been having a particularly bad day, filled with frustrations about his personal life and growing resentment about changes in department policies that he felt favored people he did not like. Instead of running her license, Morrison sat in his car for several minutes, letting Maya wait anxiously. He reached over and switched off his dashboard camera, claiming later that it had malfunctioned. The body camera on his uniform had been conveniently forgotten back at the station during his shift change. When Morrison returned to Maya's car, his demeanor had shifted from merely unfriendly to hostile. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Maya's heart began racing. "Officer, what did I do wrong? I wasn't speeding and my license is valid." "I said step out of the vehicle," Morrison repeated, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "Don't make me ask again." Maya complied, stepping out of her car with her hands visible. The night air was cool and she shivered slightly in her work uniform. "Officer, I don't understand what's happening. Can you please tell me what I did wrong?" Morrison began circling around her car, shining his flashlight through the windows. "I'm going to search your vehicle," he announced. "You were driving erratically and I suspect you might be under the influence of something." "I haven't been drinking," Maya protested. "I don't drink at all. I was driving normally." "That's what they all say," Morrison muttered, opening her car door and beginning to search through her belongings. He pulled out her backpack and dumped its contents onto the hood of her car. Textbooks, notebooks, pens, and her work uniform scattered across the metal surface. Maya watched in growing alarm as Morrison rifled through her personal belongings. She pulled out her phone and began recording, though she kept it low and tried to be discreet about it. "Officer, I don't think you have the right to search my car without a warrant or probable cause." Morrison spun around, his face flushed with anger. "Put that phone away right now," he demanded. "You're interfering with a police investigation." "I'm just recording for my own protection," Maya said, her voice beginning to shake. "This doesn't seem right." "I said put the phone away," Morrison shouted, taking a step toward her. The situation was escalating rapidly beyond anything Maya had ever experienced. Maya quickly sent a text message to her father. "Dad, I got pulled. Over on Highway 67 near mile marker 23. The officer is acting strange and I'm scared. He's searching my car for no reason." She hit send just as Morrison grabbed for her phone. "Give me that device," Morrison ordered, but Maya instinctively pulled her hand back. In that moment, Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He later claimed that Maya had reached for something threatening, that he feared for his safety, that she had made aggressive movements toward him. The truth was simpler and more terrible. Morrison drew his service weapon and fired 3 shots into Maya Carter's chest at close range. The sound echoed across the empty highway as Maya collapsed onto the asphalt, her phone clattering away from her outstretched hand. Morrison stood, over her fallen body, breathing heavily. Maya's eyes were still open, staring up at the night sky, her lips moving slightly as she tried to speak. Blood spread across her work shirt, dark against the yellow fabric. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47, Morrison said into his radio, his voice surprisingly steady. "I have shots fired on Highway 67 near mile marker 23. Suspect is down. I need backup and an ambulance immediately." Maya Carter died on the side of Highway 67 at 10:23 p.m., 36 minutes after being pulled over for no legitimate reason. Her last text message to her father remained unread on his phone, as Lieutenant Colonel Jake Carter was in a training meeting that had run late into the evening. By the time he saw his daughter's message, it would be too late to save her, but not too late to seek justice for what had been done to her. Morrison spent the next hour constructing his version of events, a story that would paint Maya as aggressive and threatening, a narrative designed to justify the unjustifiable. He did not know that Maya's phone had automatically uploaded her final text message and the brief video she had recorded to a cloud storage service. He did not know that her father was a man with very specific skills and an unwavering sense of justice. Most importantly, he did not know that his actions on this quiet highway had just set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately destroy him and expose the corruption he represented. Lieutenant Colonel Jake Carter was reviewing training reports when his phone buzzed on the desk beside him. The meeting had gone longer than expected, discussing new protocols for urban warfare scenarios. Jake glanced at the screen and saw Maya's name, but decided to finish the paragraph he was reading before checking her message. It was a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. 20 minutes later, when Jake finally looked at his phone, Maya's text message made his blood run cold. His daughter was scared, alone on a highway, and something was wrong with a police officer. Jake immediately tried calling her back, but the phone went straight to voicemail. He tried again and again, each unanswered ring increasing his anxiety. Jake left the meeting without explanation and drove toward Highway 67, calling Maya's phone continuously. The drive felt endless, every minute stretching like an hour. When he reached mile marker 23, he saw the flashing lights of multiple police cars and an ambulance. Crime scene tape blocked access to a section of the highway where a small sedan sat abandoned on the shoulder. A uniformed officer approached Jake as he parked his truck. "Sir, you need to move along. This is a crime scene." "That's my daughter's car," Jake said, pointing toward the sedan. His voice remained steady through years of military training, but inside he felt like his world was collapsing. The officer's expression changed immediately. "Sir, I'm going to need you to wait here while I get someone to speak with you." Detective Larry Brooks arrived 15 minutes later, a heavy-set man with tired eyes and a rumpled suit. He approached Jake with the practiced sympathy of someone who had delivered bad news many times before. "Mr. Carter, I'm very sorry to inform you that your daughter Maya was involved in a shooting incident earlier tonight," Brooks began. "She was killed during a traffic stop when she became combative with the officer and reached for what appeared to be a weapon." Jake felt the words hit him like physical blows. Maya was dead. His bright, gentle daughter, who wanted to become a teacher, was gone. For several moments, he could not speak or even breathe properly. "What weapon?" Jake finally managed to ask. Brooks consulted his notes. Officer Morrison believed she was reaching for a knife or possibly a gun. The situation escalated quickly when she refused to comply with his orders and began acting aggressively. Something about the explanation did not sit right with Jake, but he was too overwhelmed with grief to think clearly. He identified Maya's body at the morgue, signed papers, and made the horrible phone calls to family members. For 3 days, Jake moved through the necessary tasks like a man walking underwater. On the 4th day, Jake began to think like a soldier again. He requested copies of all police reports related to Maya's death. He studied the official narrative carefully, looking for inconsistencies and gaps. Officer Morrison claimed that Maya had been speeding, acting suspiciously, and had become combative when asked to step out of her vehicle. According to the report, Morrison's dashboard camera had malfunctioned, and his body camera had been left at the station due to an equipment mix-up. Jake found Maya's phone among her personal effects returned by the police. When he accessed her cloud storage account, he discovered the text message she had sent him and a brief video she had recorded during the traffic stop. The video showed Morrison dumping her belongings and Maya asking reasonable questions about why she was being detained. Her voice on the recording was nervous but polite, nothing like the aggressive behavior described in the police report. Jake made copies of everything and began his own investigation. Using contacts from his military career, he ran background checks on Officer Kyle Morrison. What he discovered made him angry in a way he had not felt since combat operations overseas. Morrison had been involved in 7 use-of-force incidents in the past 5 years, all involving minorities. 2 had resulted in serious injuries, but each case had been ruled justified by internal affairs. Morrison had received multiple citizen complaints for excessive force and racial profiling, but none had resulted in disciplinary action. Jake dug deeper into Morrison's history and found a pattern of behavior that painted a clear picture. Morrison specifically targeted young people of color during traffic stops, particularly in isolated areas where there would be no witnesses. He had a habit of claiming his cameras malfunctioned at critical moments, and his reports consistently described victims as aggressive or threatening, regardless of evidence to the contrary. Detective Brooks had closed Maya's case without interviewing any potential witnesses or examining her phone records. The shooting had been ruled justified within 48 hours, an unusually quick conclusion for such an incident. When Jake requested to speak with Internal Affairs, he was told that Officer Morrison had been cleared of any wrongdoing and that the case was closed. Jake realized that he was dealing with more than one corrupt cop. The entire system was protecting Morrison, covering up his pattern of violence and racism. Phone records showed that Morrison had called Police Chief Richard Kane immediately after the shooting, before calling for backup or medical assistance. Kane had arrived at the scene before the ambulance and had spent 20 minutes alone with Morrison before other officers arrived. The medical examiner's report stated that Maya had died from 3 gunshot wounds to the chest, fired from a distance of less than 6 feet. Powder burns on her clothing indicated she had been shot at close range while standing still, contradicting Morrison's claim that she had been moving aggressively toward him. Jake obtained traffic camera footage from a gas station 2 miles from the shooting location. The timestamp showed Maya's car passing by at 9:43 p.m., traveling at normal speed with no erratic driving behavior. This directly contradicted Morrison's claim that he had pulled her over for speeding and suspicious driving. As Jake assembled the evidence, a cold fury settled in his chest. Maya had been murdered by a racist cop who knew the system would protect him. She had done nothing wrong except be in the wrong place when Morrison decided he needed to hurt someone who looked like her. Jake had spent 22 years in the military, including multiple deployments with Special Forces units. He had been trained in surveillance, intelligence gathering, psychological operations, and precision targeting. He understood how to plan complex operations and execute them without leaving traces. Most importantly, he knew how to identify and eliminate threats to innocent people. The police department had made a critical error in assuming that Jake would accept their lies and move on with his life. They did not know that they had just made an enemy of someone with very specific skills and absolutely nothing left to lose. Jake began planning his campaign with the same methodical precision he had once used to plan military operations. Morrison and his conspirators had killed his daughter and thought they could hide behind badges and official lies. They were about to learn that some fathers will pursue justice no matter how long it takes or what it costs them. The war for Maya's justice was about to begin and Jake Carter intended to win it. Jake Carter rented a small apartment under an assumed name 3 blocks from the Riverside Police Department. He paid cash for 6 months up front and told the landlord he was a traveling consultant who needed temporary housing. The apartment was sparse and functional, containing only the equipment Jake needed for his investigation. The first step was comprehensive surveillance of Officer Kyle Morrison. Jake had learned patience during years of military operations, and he applied that same methodical approach to studying his target. He followed Morrison for 2 weeks, documenting his daily routines, identifying his habits, and mapping his movements. Morrison lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. He followed the same route to work each morning, stopped at the same gas station for coffee, and spent his off-duty time at 3 different bars depending on his mood. Morrison had few friends and no close relationships, which would make Jake's job easier. Jake discovered that Morrison was deeply in debt from gambling losses and alimony payments to his ex-wife. The officer worked overtime shifts whenever possible and had been caught padding his arrest numbers to qualify for performance bonuses. Morrison's financial desperation made him even more dangerous, as he had strong motivation to protect his job at any cost. Using surveillance equipment purchased with cash from different stores, Jake began monitoring Morrison's communications. He learned that Morrison met regularly with Detective Larry Brooks and Police Chief Richard Kane at a diner called Murphy's Place. The 3 men discussed cases over breakfast, often joking about citizens who complained about police conduct. Jake recorded their conversations using directional microphones and discovered that the corruption ran deeper than he had imagined. Morrison was part of a network that included at least 8 officers, 2 detectives, and several supervisors. They called themselves the Brotherhood and had been covering for each other's misconduct for over a decade. The recordings revealed that Maya was not Morrison's first victim. Officer Greg Adams had killed a 17-year-old boy named Marcus Johnson during a traffic stop 6 months earlier. The incident had been covered up using the same methods: malfunctioning cameras, claims of aggressive behavior, and quick clearance by internal affairs. Jake compiled a list of victims and began reaching out to their families. Most were afraid to talk, having been intimidated by police or discouraged by lawyers who claimed they had no case. But slowly, Jake began building a network of grieving parents and siblings who wanted justice for their loved ones. Sarah Martinez had lost her brother Carlos to Officer Adams in what was ruled a justified shooting. Tony Williams' cousin Kevin had died after being beaten during an arrest that Morrison had participated in. Linda Thompson's son Danny had been shot by Officer Pete Collins during what police claimed was a drug bust, though no drugs were found. Each family had been given the same runaround by the police department. Their loved ones were described as criminals who had brought their deaths upon themselves. Evidence had mysteriously disappeared or been deemed inadmissible. Complaints to internal affairs had been dismissed without investigation. Jake began teaching these families how to document new evidence and preserve records. He showed them how to use social media and public records requests to uncover information that police had tried to hide. Most importantly, he helped them understand that they were not alone in their fight for justice. Meanwhile, Jake continued his surveillance of Morrison and his associates. He learned their patrol routes, their radio codes, and their standard procedures for covering up misconduct. Jake discovered that they often coordinated their stories through text messages sent on personal phones rather than official communication channels. Using his military training in electronic surveillance, Jake found ways to monitor these communications without being detected. He learned that Morrison was becoming increasingly paranoid about being watched, though he had not yet identified Jake as the source of his anxiety. The breakthrough came when Jake intercepted a conversation between Morrison and Chief Kane discussing a new incident. Officer Adams had roughed up a teenager during a traffic stop the previous night, and they needed to make sure the boy's family did not file a complaint. Jake arrived at the teenager's house before the police intimidation team and warned the family about what was coming. He helped them contact a civil rights lawyer and provided them with recording equipment to document any threats from police officers. When Detective Brooks arrived to pressure the family into staying quiet, they were ready for him. The teenager's mother recorded Brooks implying that her son would face trumped-up charges if she pursued a complaint. The recording became the first piece of evidence in what would become a federal investigation. Jake realized that he could not take down the corruption network through violence alone. He needed to destroy their ability to cover for each other and protect their criminal activities. This meant exposing them to outside authorities who could not be bought or intimidated. Jake began compiling evidence packages and sending them anonymously to journalists, civil rights organizations, and federal agencies. He included recordings, photographs, and detailed timelines showing patterns of abuse and cover-up. Each package was carefully crafted to tell a specific part of the larger story. The first newspaper article appeared 3 weeks after Jake began his campaign. An investigative reporter named Helen Rodriguez published a story questioning the high number of justified shootings by Riverside police officers. The article included statistics showing that Riverside officers used deadly force at twice the rate of neighboring departments. Chief Kane called an emergency meeting of his inner circle, including Morrison, Brooks, and Adams. Jake had placed listening devices in their usual meeting spots and recorded their panicked discussion about how to respond to the negative publicity. Morrison was especially agitated, convinced that someone was deliberately targeting him. "This isn't a coincidence," he told the group. "Someone is digging into our business and trying to cause trouble." Chief Kane ordered all members of the Brotherhood to be extra careful about their activities and to report any suspicious contacts from reporters or federal agents. They began using coded language in their communications and changed their meeting locations frequently. But Jake stayed ahead of them, using tracking devices and long-range surveillance to monitor their movements. He had turned hunting corrupt cops into a full-time mission, applying the same skills he had once used to track enemy combatants in foreign countries. Jake's investigation uncovered financial records showing that several officers had been taking money from drug dealers in exchange for looking the other way during raids. Morrison himself had accepted over $50,000 in bribes over the past 2 years, money he had used to pay gambling debts and support his lifestyle. As Jake prepared to escalate his campaign, he received a phone call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was distorted by a voice changer, but the message was clear. "We know you're the one causing trouble for our boys," the caller said. "Stop digging into things that don't concern you, or you'll end up like your daughter." Jake smiled as he hung up the phone. They had just made their first major mistake by threatening him directly. Now he knew they were scared and desperate enough to make errors that would expose them further. The hunt was about to become much more intense, and Jake Carter was ready for whatever they wanted to bring to the fight. Officer Kyle Morrison had not slept well in 3 weeks. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every unexpected sound made him reach for his weapon. He knew someone was watching him, though he could never spot his surveillance team. Morrison had become convinced that federal agents were building a case against him, but he had no idea how close to the truth he actually was. Jake Carter observed Morrison's deteriorating mental state with cold satisfaction. The corrupt cop was making mistakes, becoming sloppy in his procedures, and alienating his fellow officers with increasingly paranoid behavior. Jake's psychological pressure campaign was working exactly as intended. Morrison's latest error had been significant. During a routine patrol, he had pulled over a middle-aged white businessman for a minor traffic violation. Still on edge from weeks of anxiety, Morrison had been unusually aggressive during the stop, screaming at the driver and threatening to arrest him for imaginary offenses. Unfortunately for Morrison, the businessman was City Councilman Robert Hayes, who had been returning home from a political fundraiser. Hayes was well-connected, wealthy, and not the type of person Morrison could intimidate into silence. The councilman filed a formal complaint and demanded an investigation into Morrison's conduct. Chief Kane found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to discipline Morrison to appease an influential politician while still protecting his corrupt officer from more serious consequences. Kane suspended Morrison for 3 days without pay and ordered him to attend anger management counseling. Morrison was furious about the suspension and blamed Jake for his troubles, though he still did not know Jake's identity. "Whoever is doing this to me is going to pay," Morrison told Detective Brooks during one of their recorded conversations. I'm going to find out who it is and teach them what happens when you mess with police officers. Jake learned about Morrison's threats through the listening devices he had placed in the police station break room. Rather than being intimidated, Jake saw an opportunity to push Morrison further toward a complete breakdown. He began leaving subtle signs of surveillance that only Morrison would notice, designed to increase the officer's paranoia without alerting his colleagues. Jake would park different rental cars where Morrison could see them during his commute to work. He would sit in restaurants where Morrison ate lunch, always wearing different disguises but positioned where Morrison might catch a glimpse of someone watching him. Jake never made direct contact or obvious threats, but maintained just enough presence to keep Morrison constantly on edge. The psychological pressure was enhanced by Jake's ongoing investigation into Morrison's past victims. He had identified 11 people killed or seriously injured by Morrison over his 15-year career, including Maya. Each case followed the same pattern: isolated traffic stops, malfunctioning cameras, claims of aggressive behavior by the victim, and quick clearance by internal affairs. Jake discovered that Morrison had specifically requested assignment to patrol routes that took him through minority neighborhoods and college areas. The officer had volunteered for late-night shifts that put him in contact with young people driving alone, particularly targeting those who appeared vulnerable or unlikely to be believed if they complained about his conduct. The most disturbing revelation came when Jake found records showing that Morrison had been rejected by the military, FBI, and state police before being hired by Riverside PD. Morrison's psychological evaluation for military service had noted concerning attitudes toward authority and potential for excessive aggression. The FBI had flagged him as unsuitable for law enforcement work due to racial bias and poor impulse control. Chief Kane had hired Morrison despite these red flags because the department was desperate for officers, and Kane appreciated Morrison's proactive approach to policing. What Kane really valued was Morrison's willingness to use violence against people Kane considered undesirable, while being smart enough to avoid creating problems with wealthy or influential citizens. Jake began preparing comprehensive dossiers on each member of the corruption network. Detective Brooks had falsified evidence in dozens of cases, planting drugs and weapons to justify arrests that advanced his career. Officer Adams had a history of domestic violence that was covered up by his colleagues. Officer Collins had been stealing money and drugs from crime scenes for years. The network's protection racket extended beyond just covering up violence. They had been taking bribes from drug dealers, protection money from illegal gambling operations, and kickbacks from towing companies and bail bondsmen. The corruption was so extensive that it affected nearly every aspect of law enforcement in Riverside. Jake documented financial records showing that Chief Kane had purchased a vacation home and expensive cars on a salary that should not have supported such luxuries. Kane's bank records revealed regular cash deposits that coincided with major drug busts where evidence had mysteriously disappeared. As Jake prepared to release more evidence to journalists and federal agencies, Morrison made another critical mistake. During a traffic stop involving a young Hispanic woman, Morrison lost control and began screaming racial slurs while demanding to search her vehicle without cause. The woman, Rosa Gutierrez, was a nurse returning home from her shift at the hospital. She had been recording the interaction on her phone when Morrison became violent, grabbing her arm and throwing her against her car. The entire incident was captured on video, including Morrison's racist language and excessive use of force. Rosa's boyfriend was a documentary filmmaker who specialized in social justice issues. Within hours, the video was online and being shared across social media platforms. Local news stations picked up the story, and civil rights organizations began demanding Morrison's immediate termination. Chief Kane was forced to place Morrison on administrative leave pending an investigation. The decision enraged Morrison, who blamed Jake for orchestrating the entire incident, though he still did not know who Jake was. Morrison's paranoia reached a breaking point when he returned home from a meeting with his lawyer to find that someone had been inside his house. Nothing had been stolen, but items had been moved slightly, just enough for Morrison to notice. A photograph of Maya Carter had been left on his kitchen table with a simple message written on the back. "Justice is coming." Morrison called Detective Brooks in a panic. "He was in my house, Larry. Whoever this guy is, he was in my house. He knows everything." Brooks tried to calm Morrison down, but the corrupt cop was beyond rational thought. Morrison began carrying multiple weapons and installed security cameras around his property. He started sleeping with a loaded shotgun beside his bed and jumping at every unexpected sound. Jake watched Morrison's deterioration with professional interest. He had seen enemy combatants break under similar psychological pressure during military operations. Morrison was following the same pattern: increasing paranoia, poor decision-making, and hostile behavior toward allies. The corrupt officer was now a liability to his fellow conspirators. Other members of the Brotherhood began distancing themselves from Morrison, afraid that his erratic behavior would expose the entire network. Chief Kane ordered Morrison to take a leave of absence and seek psychiatric help. Morrison refused to step down voluntarily, threatening to expose the entire corruption network if he was forced out. "If I go down, everybody goes down with me," he told Kane during a heated argument that Jake recorded through his surveillance devices. Kane realized that Morrison had become too dangerous to protect. The chief began making contingency plans to cut Morrison loose and pin all the corruption on him alone. Kane started destroying records and distancing himself from Morrison's activities, preparing to sacrifice his former ally to save his own career. Jake sensed that the corruption network was beginning to fracture under the pressure he had applied. Morrison was isolated and desperate, making him more dangerous but also more vulnerable. The time was approaching for Jake to move from psychological warfare to direct confrontation. But first, Jake needed to ensure that all evidence of the conspiracy was preserved and distributed to authorities who could act on it. Morrison might be his primary target, but Jake intended to destroy the entire network that had enabled his daughter's murder. The next phase of Jake's campaign would require him to emerge from the shadows and face Morrison directly. It was a risk, but Jake had concluded that only a direct confrontation would provide the evidence needed to ensure that Morrison could never hurt another innocent person. The final battle for Maya's justice was about to begin. Jake Carter had spent 6 weeks gathering evidence against the corruption network, and now he possessed enough documentation to bring down the entire conspiracy. Financial records, audio recordings, video surveillance, and witness testimonies painted a clear picture of systematic abuse and cover-up that had been going on for over a decade. The evidence showed that Chief Kane had been the mastermind behind the operation, using his position to protect corrupt officers while taking a percentage of their illegal profits. Kane had created a system where officers like Morrison could commit crimes with impunity, as long as they shared their gains and followed orders from above. Detective Brooks served as Kane's enforcer, intimidating witnesses and falsifying reports to protect the network's members. Brooks had threatened over 30 families into staying quiet about police misconduct, often implying that their children would face false charges if they pursued complaints. Jake discovered that the corruption extended beyond the police department into the local court system. Judge Patricia Coleman had been accepting bribes to dismiss charges against network members and their associates. District Attorney Frank Newman had been refusing to prosecute cases involving officer misconduct, claiming insufficient evidence, even when documentation was overwhelming. The network had even infiltrated the FBI field office through Agent Carl Mason, who had been feeding information about federal investigations back to Kane. Mason had helped the network stay one step ahead of outside scrutiny for years, warning them whenever federal agents showed interest in their activities. Jake realized that exposing the corruption through local channels would be impossible since the entire system was compromised. He needed to find federal authorities who were outside Mason's reach and could act independently of the local corruption network. Through his military contacts, Jake reached out to FBI Inspector General Patricia Walsh, who oversaw investigations into agent misconduct. Walsh was based in Washington, D.C., and had a reputation for pursuing corrupt federal agents regardless of their connections or influence. Jake sent Walsh a comprehensive evidence package containing recordings of Agent Mason coordinating with Chief Kane, financial records showing bribes and kickbacks, and detailed timelines of covered-up crimes. He included an encrypted communication method that would allow Walsh to contact him safely without alerting the local network. Walsh responded within 48 hours, expressing shock at the scope of the corruption Jake had uncovered. She informed him that the FBI was launching Operation Clean House, a joint investigation with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division that would bypass the compromised local field office entirely. Jake continued his surveillance while federal investigators began their work. Morrison had become increasingly unstable, drinking heavily and making threats against anyone he suspected of being involved in his troubles. The corrupt officer had started carrying illegal weapons and talking about taking violent action against his perceived enemies. Chief Kane was also feeling the pressure as more evidence of misconduct became public. The mayor had called for an independent investigation into the police department, and several city council members were demanding Kane's resignation. Kane knew that his career was finished, but he was determined to take as few people down with him as possible. Detective Brooks attempted to cut a deal with federal investigators, offering to testify against Kane and Morrison in exchange for immunity. Brooks provided additional evidence about the network's operations, including details about murders that had been covered up and evidence that had been destroyed. Jake learned about Brooks' cooperation through his surveillance network and realized that the corrupt detective might not receive the punishment he deserved if his deal was accepted. Brooks had personally threatened dozens of families and had played a direct role in covering up Maya's murder. To ensure that Brooks faced appropriate consequences, Jake began releasing additional evidence that showed the detective's involvement in crimes that were not covered by his immunity agreement. Jake carefully leaked information about Brooks's personal crimes, including his theft of drugs from evidence storage and his role in planting evidence on innocent suspects. Officer Adams became the next network member to crack under federal pressure. When agents raided his home, they found stolen drugs, illegal weapons, and over $200,000 in cash that Adams could not explain. Adams immediately began cooperating with investigators, providing detailed information about the network's operations in exchange for a reduced sentence. The federal investigation expanded rapidly as more evidence emerged. Agents discovered that the corruption network had connections to organized crime groups and had been providing protection for drug trafficking operations throughout the region. Kane had been receiving monthly payments from crime bosses in exchange for advance warning about raids and investigations. Morrison found himself completely isolated as his former allies either fled or began cooperating with federal authorities. The corrupt officer realized that he was going to be the primary target of the investigation and that everyone else was trying to minimize their own liability by pointing fingers at him. In a desperate attempt to save himself, Morrison demanded a meeting with Chief Kane to discuss their options. Kane agreed to meet at their usual location, unaware that Jake had placed surveillance equipment throughout the restaurant weeks earlier. During their recorded conversation, Kane and Morrison discussed destroying evidence and intimidating potential witnesses. Kane suggested that Morrison might need to disappear for a while until the federal investigation cooled down. Morrison demanded money and protection, threatening to expose Kane's involvement in multiple murders if he was abandoned. Jake provided this recording to federal investigators, giving them direct evidence of ongoing obstruction of justice and conspiracy charges. The recording also contained Morrison's admission that he had killed Maya specifically because of her race, describing her as one of those people who think they deserve special treatment. Agent Walsh coordinated with Jake to set up additional surveillance opportunities, using his access and expertise to gather evidence that federal agents could not obtain through normal channels. Jake's military training and intimate knowledge of the corruption network made him an invaluable asset to the investigation. The breakthrough came when federal agents raided Kane's office and discovered hidden safes containing over $1 million in cash, along with detailed records of bribes and protection payments. Kane had been keeping meticulous records of the network's criminal activities, apparently as insurance against his co-conspirators. Kane's records revealed the full scope of the corruption, including murders, drug trafficking, money laundering, and systematic civil rights violations. The evidence showed that at least 23 people had been killed by network members over the past decade, with their deaths covered up through false reports and destroyed evidence. Morrison's name appeared throughout Kane's records as one of the most violent and reliable members of the network. Morrison had been specifically recruited by Kane because of his racist attitudes and willingness to use lethal force against minorities. Kane's notes described Morrison as perfectly suited for cleaning up the undesirable elements in our community. Federal agents arrested Kane, Brooks, Adams, and 6 other officers simultaneously in coordinated raids designed to prevent them from destroying additional evidence or fleeing. Morrison managed to avoid arrest because he was not at his usual locations when the raids occurred. Jake realized that Morrison had probably been warned about the impending arrests and was now in hiding. The corrupt officer was desperate and dangerous. With nothing left to lose and a history of violence against innocent people, Morrison would likely try to flee the area, or might attempt to strike back at those he blamed for his downfall. Jake began preparing for a final confrontation with Morrison, knowing that the corrupt officer would eventually make a move that would expose his location. Morrison's psychological profile suggested that he would not be able to resist seeking revenge against those he held responsible for his troubles. The federal investigation had successfully exposed and dismantled the corruption network, but Morrison remained free and extremely dangerous. Jake knew that his mission would not be complete until Morrison was captured or neutralized, ensuring that he could never hurt another innocent person like Maya. The hunt for Kyle Morrison was about to become a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Jake using all of his military training to track down a desperate and violent fugitive who had nothing left to lose. Kyle Morrison had been in hiding for 4 days when he finally made contact with the outside world. Using a burner phone purchased with cash, he called his ex-wife demanding money and a place to stay. The conversation was brief and hostile, ending when she hung up after threatening to call the police if he contacted her again. Jake Carter had been monitoring Morrison's known associates and family members, expecting the fugitive cop to eventually reach out for help. Through electronic surveillance, Jake intercepted Morrison's call and traced it to a location 3 counties away. Morrison was hiding in a cheap motel under a false name, paying cash and avoiding contact with anyone who might recognize him. Rather than immediately alerting federal authorities to Morrison's location, Jake decided to continue his psychological campaign against the corrupt officer. Morrison needed to face justice, but Jake wanted to ensure that the man who killed his daughter experienced the same fear and helplessness that Maya had felt during her final moments. Jake began a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to destroy Morrison's sense of security and push him toward increasingly desperate actions. Using techniques learned during special operations training, Jake made Morrison aware that he was being hunted without revealing his own identity or location. The first phase involved making Morrison paranoid about his hideout. Jake placed small, tracking devices on Morrison's stolen car, positioned where they would be discovered during routine checks. He left subtle signs around the motel that someone had been watching Morrison's room, moving objects slightly and leaving footprints in strategic locations. Morrison discovered the tracking device 2 days later and immediately fled to a different location. But Jake had anticipated this move and had already identified 3 other motels that fit Morrison's pattern of choosing cheap, cash-only establishments with easy escape routes. Using long-range surveillance equipment, Jake watched Morrison's increasingly erratic behavior from a safe distance. The fugitive cop was drinking heavily, sleeping poorly, and jumping at every unexpected sound. Morrison had armed himself with multiple stolen weapons but seemed to realize that his situation was hopeless. Jake escalated the psychological pressure by sending anonymous messages to Morrison through untraceable communication methods. The messages contained details about Morrison's location and activities that only someone conducting close surveillance could know. "I know you're in room 237 at the Riverside Motel," read one message. "I know you ordered pizza at 9:30 p.m. and that you've been drinking whiskey since 6 p.m. You can run, but you cannot hide from justice." Morrison fled again, this time driving over 200 miles to a rural area where he thought he could disappear completely. But Jake's military training in tracking and surveillance made it impossible for Morrison to stay hidden for long. Jake had studied Morrison's psychological profile extensively and understood how the corrupt officer's mind worked. Morrison was a bully who had always relied on his badge and gun to intimidate people who could not fight back. Now that he was alone and hunted, Morrison was experiencing the same helplessness that his victims had felt. The psychological campaign intensified when Jake began leaving photographs of Maya at locations where Morrison would find them. Each photo was accompanied by names and details of Morrison's other victims, reminding him of the lives he had destroyed through his racist violence. Morrison's mental state deteriorated rapidly under the constant pressure. He began talking to himself, drinking more heavily and making increasingly poor decisions about his security. The fugitive cop was becoming convinced that he was being hunted by federal agents with unlimited resources and sophisticated technology. Jake enhanced this impression by using military-grade surveillance equipment that Morrison could sometimes detect but never fully understand. Jake would use thermal imaging to track Morrison's movements inside buildings, then leave evidence that someone had been monitoring him from impossible distances. The psychological warfare reached a new level when Jake began predicting Morrison's actions and leaving messages about his plans before he carried them out. When Morrison decided to rob a convenience store for money, he found a note on his car afterward that read, "I knew you would steal from the store on Pine Street. Your desperation is making you predictable." Morrison became convinced that his hunter possessed supernatural abilities or access to technology beyond normal law enforcement capabilities. The corrupt officer began exhibiting signs of severe paranoia, constantly looking over his shoulder and changing his plans multiple times each day. Jake's campaign was designed not just to capture Morrison, but to ensure that he experienced maximum psychological trauma before facing justice. Morrison had terrorized innocent people for years, using his position of authority to victimize those who could not defend themselves. Now Morrison was learning what it felt like to be hunted by someone with superior skills and resources. The breakthrough came when Morrison's desperation drove him to make a critical mistake. Unable to access his bank accounts or contact his associates without being traced, Morrison decided to return to Riverside to recover money he had hidden in his house before fleeing. Jake had been monitoring Morrison's abandoned house since the federal raids began, expecting that the fugitive might eventually return for his hidden assets. When Morrison's stolen car appeared in the neighborhood, Jake was ready with a comprehensive surveillance network that tracked every move. Morrison waited until 3 a.m. before approaching his house, using skills learned during police training to avoid detection. But Jake's military experience in urban operations made him far more skilled at surveillance and tracking than Morrison could imagine. Jake watched as Morrison broke into his own house and began searching for hidden money and weapons. The corrupt officer moved quickly through the dark house, gathering cash from various hiding places and stuffing it into a backpack, along with spare ammunition and identification documents. Rather than apprehending Morrison immediately, Jake decided to let him escape with the items and continue the psychological campaign. Morrison needed to believe that he had successfully evaded capture, only to discover that his every move was still being monitored and predicted. When Morrison returned to his car, he found another message waiting for him. "I watched you take the money from behind the water heater and the gun from under the basement stairs. You cannot hide from me no matter where you go." Morrison's psychological breakdown accelerated after this incident. He began driving aimlessly for hours, changing direction randomly, and stopping at random locations in an attempt to confuse his pursuer. But Jake's electronic surveillance made it easy to track Morrison's movements regardless of his evasive maneuvers. The psychological campaign was having its intended effect. Morrison was experiencing the same terror and helplessness that his victims had felt, knowing that someone more powerful was hunting him and that escape was impossible. Jake wanted Morrison to understand exactly what Maya had gone through during her final moments. As Morrison's mental state continued to deteriorate, Jake began preparing for the final phase of his campaign. The corrupt officer was now completely isolated, paranoid, and desperate. He would soon make a mistake that would allow Jake to confront him directly and obtain the evidence needed to ensure Morrison faced the full consequences of his crimes. Morrison's psychological torture was approaching its climax, and Jake was satisfied that the man who had murdered his daughter was finally experiencing appropriate justice. The final confrontation would determine whether Morrison would surrender to authorities or force Jake to take more direct action to protect future innocent victims. Either way, Kyle Morrison's reign of terror was about to end permanently. Kyle Morrison had reached his breaking point. After 2 weeks of being hunted like an animal, the corrupt officer decided that his only option was to eliminate the threat hunting him. Morrison had become convinced that a single federal agent with advanced technology was responsible for his torment, and he planned to ambush and kill his pursuer before fleeing the country. Morrison chose the abandoned warehouse district near the old railway yards as his location for the ambush. The area was isolated, with multiple escape routes and plenty of places to hide weapons and surveillance equipment. Morrison spent an entire day preparing the site, setting up positions where he could observe approaches while remaining hidden. Jake Carter had been monitoring Morrison's communications and movements through electronic surveillance, so he knew about Morrison's plan almost as soon as the corrupt officer began implementing it. Rather than avoiding the trap, Jake decided to use Morrison's ambush attempt as an opportunity for a final confrontation that would provide conclusive evidence of Morrison's guilt. Jake spent 2 days preparing his own counter-ambush, using his Special Forces training to turn Morrison's advantages into weaknesses. While Morrison focused on covering obvious approach routes, Jake identified alternative access points that would allow him to control the encounter from a position of superior tactical advantage. The warehouse Morrison had chosen was part of a complex of abandoned buildings that Jake had surveyed extensively. Jake knew every entrance, exit, and hiding place in the area, giving him a significant advantage over Morrison, who had only spent 1 day preparing the site. Jake also prepared a comprehensive surveillance network throughout the warehouse complex, using wireless cameras and audio recording equipment to document everything that would happen during the confrontation. Federal authorities would need clear evidence of Morrison's actions and statements to ensure a successful prosecution. On the night of the confrontation, Morrison arrived at the warehouse early and took up his position with a rifle stolen during one of his earlier crimes. Morrison was confident that he would be able to eliminate his pursuer and escape to a country without an extradition treaty with the United States. Jake arrived 2 hours later, moving through the warehouse complex with the stealth and precision learned during years of special operations missions. Morrison's amateur surveillance skills were no match for Jake's professional training, allowing Jake to approach within 50 feet of Morrison's position without being detected. Instead of attacking immediately, Jake used a voice amplification system to communicate with Morrison from a concealed position. "Kyle Morrison, this is Lieutenant Colonel Jake Carter, United States Army. You murdered my daughter Maya Carter, and now you're going to answer for what you did." Morrison spun around, wildly, trying to locate the source of Jake's voice while keeping his rifle ready to fire. "I don't know what you're talking about," Morrison shouted. "Maya Carter was a criminal who tried to attack me. I was defending myself." Jake's voice came from a different direction, demonstrating his ability to move without being detected. Maya was a 19-year-old college student who had never been arrested or committed any crime. You killed her because you're a racist coward who enjoys hurting innocent people. Morrison fired several shots toward the sound of Jake's voice, but hit nothing except concrete walls and empty air. Morrison was beginning to panic as he realized that his opponent possessed superior tactical skills and was controlling the encounter completely. "Come out and fight me like a man," Morrison yelled, continuing to search for Jake's position. "You've been stalking me for weeks like some kind of psychopath. If you want to settle this, then show yourself." Jake's response came from yet another location, proving that he could move around Morrison at will. "You want to know what it feels like to be hunted by someone more powerful than you? You want to experience the fear that Maya felt when you decided to murder her for no reason except the color of her skin?" Morrison's psychological breakdown accelerated as he realized the hopelessness of his situation. The corrupt officer had spent his career victimizing people who could not fight back, but now he was facing someone with superior training and equipment who could not be intimidated or overpowered. "Maya Carter was reaching for a weapon," Morrison screamed, still trying to maintain his false narrative. "She was acting aggressively and I had to defend myself. Any cop would have done the same thing in that situation." Jake's voice carried a cold fury that made Morrison's blood run cold. Maya was holding her phone, trying to call for help because a racist cop was terrorizing her during an illegal traffic stop. "You shot an unarmed teenager 3 times in the chest Because you wanted to kill someone that night. Morrison continued, firing randomly in different directions, wasting ammunition and revealing his increasing desperation. Jake allowed Morrison to exhaust most of his ammunition before making his next move, ensuring that the corrupt officer would be less dangerous during the final phase of their confrontation. I have recordings of you admitting that you killed Maya because of her race, Jake announced. I have evidence that you've been taking bribes from drug dealers and covering up crimes for years. Your entire network has been exposed and your co-conspirators are already in federal custody. Morrison's rifle clicked empty as he tried to fire again. In his panic, he had forgotten to count his shots and now found himself effectively disarmed. Morrison drew his sidearm and continued searching for Jake's position, but his hands were shaking so badly that he could barely hold the weapon. Jake finally revealed himself, stepping into view with his own weapon drawn but pointed downward in a non-threatening position. Morrison was shocked to see that his tormentor was a middle-aged black man in civilian clothes rather than the federal agent with high-tech equipment that he had imagined. "You're just one man," Morrison said in disbelief. "How did you do all this? How did you track me and predict my movements?" Jake's response was delivered with military precision and quiet intensity. "I'm a soldier who spent 22 years learning how to hunt enemies of the United States. You became my enemy when you murdered my daughter, and I used every skill I learned in the military to track you down." Morrison raised his pistol toward Jake, but his hands were shaking too badly to aim accurately. "You can't prove anything," Morrison said desperately. "It's your word against mine, and I'm a police officer with 15 years of experience." Jake gestured toward the surveillance cameras that were recording their entire conversation. "I can prove everything. I have recordings of you admitting your crimes, financial records showing your bribes, and video evidence of your racist violence." "You're finished, Morrison." Morrison realized that his situation was hopeless, but his racist hatred overcame his survival instincts. "Your daughter got what she deserved," Morrison snarled. "All of you people need to learn your place and stop thinking you're equal to real Americans." Morrison's racist rant was exactly what Jake needed to complete his evidence package. With awe, Morrison's own words captured on multiple recording devices. There would be no question about his motives for killing Maya and his other victims. Jake used his military training to disarm Morrison without causing permanent injury, though he was tempted to deliver the same kind of violence that Morrison had inflicted on innocent victims. Jake's discipline and commitment to justice prevented him from becoming the same kind of criminal that Morrison represented. Within minutes, federal agents surrounded the warehouse complex and took Morrison into custody. Agent Walsh had been monitoring Jake's communications and was ready to move as soon as the confrontation concluded. Morrison would face federal charges for civil rights violations, murder, corruption, and dozens of other crimes. As Morrison was led away in handcuffs, Jake felt a sense of completion that he had not experienced since Maya's death. The man who killed his daughter would spend the rest of his life in prison, and the corruption network that protected him had been completely destroyed. Jake had used his military skills to achieve something that the civilian justice system could not accomplish. Alone, through patience, precision, and tactical superiority, he had brought down an entire network of corrupt officials and ensured that they could never hurt another innocent person. The confrontation had provided the final pieces of evidence needed to guarantee Morrison's conviction and expose the full extent of the conspiracy. Maya's death had been avenged, and justice had been served through a combination of military expertise and unwavering determination. 6 months after Kyle Morrison's arrest, the federal courthouse in downtown Riverside was packed with families of victims, civil rights activists, and journalists covering the conclusion of the largest police corruption trial in the state's history. Morrison sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, no longer the arrogant officer who had terrorized innocent people for over a decade. The evidence that Jake Carter had gathered proved to be the foundation for prosecuting not just Morrison, but the entire network of corrupt officials who had enabled his crimes. Chief Kane had already pleaded guilty to racketeering, civil rights violations, and conspiracy charges in exchange for a 30-year prison sentence. Detective Brooks received 25 years after his immunity deal was revoked due to additional crimes that Jake had exposed. Morrison's trial lasted 3 weeks, with prosecutors presenting overwhelming evidence of his racist violence and systematic abuse of power. The recordings Jake had obtained showed Morrison admitting to killing Maya because of her race, and financial records proved his involvement in drug trafficking and bribery schemes. Agent Walsh testified about the scope of the corruption network, and how Jake's investigation had provided the breakthrough needed to expose crimes that had been covered up for years. The FBI inspector praised Jake's methodical approach and military precision in gathering evidence that civilian investigators could not have obtained. The families of Morrison's victims testified about the impact of his violence on their lives. Sarah Martinez spoke about losing her brother Carlos to Officer Adams, while Tony Williams described how his cousin Kevin had been beaten to death during an arrest that Morrison had participated in. Each family thanked Jake for giving them the justice that the local system had denied them. Morrison's defense attorney tried to argue that his client had been entrapped by Jake's psychological campaign, claiming that the stress of being hunted had driven Morrison to make statements he did not mean. The argument failed completely when prosecutors played recordings of Morrison making racist threats years before Jake began his investigation. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Morrison was convicted of federal civil rights violations, first-degree murder, conspiracy, racketeering, drug trafficking, and obstruction of justice. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Morrison was led away in handcuffs for the final time, he turned to look at Jake, who was sitting in the front row of the courthouse gallery. Morrison's expression showed a mixture of hatred and defeat, the look of a man who had finally faced consequences for his actions. Jake felt no satisfaction in Morrison's suffering, only relief that the corrupt officer could never hurt another, innocent person. Maya's death had been avenged through the legal system rather than through vigilante violence, proving that justice could prevail when people with the right skills were willing to fight for it. The federal investigation had resulted in the prosecution of 23 current and former police officers, 5 judges, 2 prosecutors, and 1 FBI agent. The Riverside Police Department was placed under federal oversight, with new leadership and policies designed to prevent future corruption. Jake established the Maya Carter Foundation for Police Accountability, using his military pension and donations from supporters to help other families investigate police misconduct and corruption. The foundation provided legal assistance, investigative support, and technological resources to families who lacked the means to fight powerful institutions alone. The foundation's first major success came when they helped expose a similar corruption network in a neighboring state, using techniques that Jake had developed during his campaign against Morrison. Jake trained a team of former military personnel and retired federal agents to conduct investigations that civilian lawyers and activists could not accomplish on their own. Jake's story became a symbol of how individual determination and specialized skills could overcome institutional corruption and systemic racism. Military veterans across the country contacted the foundation, offering their services to help investigate police misconduct in their own communities. The federal government implemented new policies for investigating police corruption, incorporating lessons learned from Jake's successful campaign against Morrison's network. FBI agents received training in techniques that Jake had used, and new procedures were established for bypassing local corruption when investigating law enforcement misconduct. Maya's story was featured in documentaries and news reports that highlighted the problem of police violence against minorities and the importance of accountability in law enforcement. Her image became a symbol of innocent victims who deserved justice rather than cover-ups and lies. Jake never returned to active military duty, instead dedicating his life to continuing the fight for justice that had begun with Maya's death. He spoke at police academies and military training facilities, teaching officers and soldiers about the importance of protecting innocent people rather than abusing their authority. The warehouse where Jake confronted Morrison was turned into a memorial for victims of police violence, with Maya's name prominently displayed alongside those of Morrison's other victims. The memorial served as a reminder that ordinary people could fight back against corruption when they possessed the skills and determination to seek justice. Jake often visited Maya's grave to tell her about the foundation's successes and the changes that her death had inspired. He knew that she would be proud of how her father had channeled his grief into a force for positive change that helped other families avoid the pain that he had experienced. The Maya Carter Foundation expanded its mission to include training programs for military veterans who wanted to use their skills in civilian law enforcement or investigative work. The programs emphasized ethical conduct, constitutional rights, and the importance of protecting all citizens regardless of their race or social status. Jake's campaign against Morrison had demonstrated that human tactical brilliance, determination, and superior training could overcome even the most entrenched corruption. His success inspired other veterans to apply their military skills to civilian problems, creating a new generation of investigators and advocates who could not be intimidated or bought off. Years later, when Jake looked back on his confrontation with Morrison, he realized that the most important victory had not been Morrison's conviction, but the systematic changes that had prevented other corrupt officers from following Morrison's example. Maya's death had exposed a cancer in the justice system, and Jake's military precision had provided the surgery needed to remove it. The fight for justice would continue as long as there were people willing to abuse their authority and hurt innocent victims. But Jake had proven that corruption and racism could be defeated when good people possess the skills, determination, and courage to fight back against institutional evil. Maya Carter's legacy lived on through every family that received justice, every corrupt officer who was held accountable, and every community that was protected by the foundation that bore her name. Her father had turned personal tragedy into a force for systemic change, proving that human love and determination could overcome even the most powerful enemies. Jake Carter had honored his daughter's memory by ensuring that her death would save other innocent lives and that justice would prevail over corruption no matter how long the fight might take. In the end, that was the greatest victory that any father could achieve.